December 29, 1944. McGuire Field, Mindoro, Philippine Islands. The radar operator's hands moved across the glowing green scope in the cramped rear compartment of the P-61 Black Widow, his eyes fixed on a cluster of blips that shouldn't have existed. Lieutenant Philip Porter adjusted the range scale on his SCR-720 radar set and spoke into the intercom with a voice that betrayed no emotion despite what he was seeing. "Major, we have multiple contacts. Bearing 045, range approximately 8 miles. Count is 4, possibly 5 aircraft. Altitude 12,000 feet. They're heading directly for the airfield." In the pilot's seat ahead of him, Major Carroll C. Smith did not reply immediately. The squadron commander from the Midwest had been flying night missions for months, and he had learned that patience mattered more than speed in the deadly game of nocturnal aerial combat. Through the scratched plexiglass of his canopy, the Philippine night stretched endlessly black, punctuated only by the distant glow of fires still burning from the day's ground combat. Somewhere in that darkness, Japanese aircraft were approaching the American airfield with lethal intent. What happened over the next 80 minutes would transform how the Imperial Japanese military understood American technological capability. A single aircraft, invisible in the night sky, would systematically destroy 4 enemy aircraft using technology the Japanese High Command had dismissed as impossible to deploy in combat quantities. The radar screens at Japanese airfields across the Philippines would record aircraft departing for their missions. None of them would record those aircraft returning. The psychological impact would ripple through Japanese aircrews for the remaining months of the war. Pilots who had operated with near impunity under the cover of darkness would suddenly find themselves hunted by an enemy they could neither see nor escape. The night, which had been their sanctuary and their greatest tactical advantage for 3 years of Pacific warfare, would become their graveyard. And at the center of this transformation stood one American pilot, one radar operator, and one aircraft that had been purpose-built to own the darkness. The crisis that brought Major Smith into the Philippine sky that December night had been building since the American landings on Leyte in October 1944. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines as promised, wading ashore through the surf at Red Beach to fulfill the pledge he had made when forced to abandon the islands in 1942. But his forces found themselves locked in a desperate struggle against an enemy who refused to concede defeat despite overwhelming American air and naval superiority. Japanese air power, though diminished from its 1942 peak, remained a lethal threat, particularly after darkness fell. American aircraft controlled the daylight hours almost as team. Completely. Formations of P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and the new P-51 Mustangs swept the skies clean of Japanese opposition. But sunset changed the equation dramatically. As the tropical twilight faded into darkness, American fighters returned to their bases, and Japanese aircraft emerged from hidden airstrips scattered across the Philippine archipelago. For years, Japanese aircrews had perfected the art of night operations. Single aircraft or small formations would appear over American positions hours after sunset, conducting reconnaissance missions to photograph American installations or dropping bombs with impunity before vanishing into the darkness. American soldiers called these raiders Washing Machine Charlie for the distinctive sound of their unsynchronized engines, a deliberate tactic designed to maximize psychological terror. The throbbing, irregular drone would echo across the jungle for hours, keeping exhausted troops awake and destroying morale more effectively than the bombs themselves. The aircraft conducting these night operations varied considerably in type and purpose. Twin-engine Nakajima J1N fighters, designated Irving by Allied intelligence, served dual roles as night fighters and reconnaissance platforms. Originally designed as a long-range escort fighter to accompany bomber formations on distant missions, the Irving had proven inadequate in that role when faced with nimble Allied interceptors. But the aircraft found new purpose prowling the darkness, where its range and endurance proved valuable and its lack of agility mattered less. Its crew of 2 or 3 included observers and gunners who scanned the skies for targets, though their weapons were useless against threats they could not see. Floatplane fighters like the A6M2-N Rufe operated from protected anchorages where conventional aircraft could not reach, extending Japanese air power across waters where land-based aircraft could not easily deploy. The Rufe was essentially a Zero fighter modified with a large central float and two smaller wing floats, trading some performance for the ability to operate without runways. Japanese forces used them extensively throughout the island campaigns for reconnaissance and patrol duties. And increasingly, the formidable Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, known to Allied intelligence as Frank, was being employed in night roles. Many aviation historians consider the Ki-84 the best Japanese fighter of the entire war. It was fast, approaching 400 miles per hour in level flight. It was heavily armed with two 20mm cannons and two machine guns. And unlike most Japanese aircraft, it incorporated armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. A Ki 84 inches daylight combat was a formidable opponent for any American fighter, but at night, stripped of the visibility and maneuverability that made it dangerous, even this excellent aircraft became prey. American forces possessed nothing capable of reliably finding these Japanese aircraft in the darkness before the Black Widow arrived. Anti-aircraft guns blazed away at sounds in the sky, rarely hitting anything, and often creating more danger for American troops from falling shell fragments than for Japanese aircraft from direct hits. Searchlights swept back and forth across the clouds, their beams providing targets for Japanese gunners more often than illuminating enemies for American defenders. Day fighters were essentially useless at night, their pilots unable to find targets in the blackness even when ground controllers could tell them approximately where to look. The Japanese owned the darkness, until the Black Widow arrived. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow had been designed from the beginning for a single purpose: to find and destroy enemy aircraft in complete darkness. Unlike hastily converted day, fighters pressed into night duty with radar sets awkwardly bolted onto airframes never intended to carry them. The Black Widow was engineered specifically around a revolutionary piece of technology that most Japanese military planners believed America incapable of producing in combat quantities. The aircraft's genesis traced back to October 1940, when German bombers were devastating London during the terrifying campaign known as the Blitz. Lieutenant General Delos Emmons of the United States Army Air Corps witnessed the night raids firsthand and recognized that America would eventually need its own dedicated night fighter capability. He summoned Vladimir Pavleka, Chief of Research at the Northrop Aircraft Corporation, to a secret meeting at Wright Field in Ohio. There, Pavleka received specifications for a new type of aircraft, one equipped with an unnamed device that could see and distinguish other airplanes in total darkness. He was forbidden to take notes and instructed to commit the requirements to memory. Pavleka flew overnight back to California and briefed Jack Northrop the following morning. Northrop, a visionary designer who had already pioneered flying wing concepts that would eventually lead to modern stealth aircraft like the B-2 Spirit bomber, recognized both the opportunity and the challenge presented by this urgent military requirement. Within 2 weeks, he had developed a preliminary design that incorporated the British-developed radar equipment into a purpose-built American airframe unlike anything previously attempted. The aircraft would be large enough to carry the heavy radar equipment and a 3-man crew, while still possessing the performance necessary to catch enemy bombers in the night sky. The contract was approved on January 30th, 1941, nearly 11 months before Pearl Harbor would bring America into the war. Northrop's small company, which had been primarily operating as a subcontractor for larger aircraft manufacturers, suddenly found itself responsible for developing one of the most technologically sophisticated combat aircraft in the world. The engineering challenges were immense. The radar equipment alone weighed over 500 pounds and required dedicated space for both the antenna system and the operator's station. The aircraft needed enough power to achieve fighter-like performance despite carrying this equipment plus heavy armament and fuel for extended patrols. The prototype XP-61 made its first flight on May 26, 1942. Piloted by Northrop test pilot Vance Breeze at Northrop Field in Hawthorne, California. Despite its enormous size, the aircraft handled beautifully according to Breeze's report. The twin-boom configuration that gave the Black Widow its distinctive appearance proved aerodynamically sound, providing excellent stability and control characteristics that impressed everyone who flew the new fighter. Production delays caused by the complexity of the aircraft and competition for components with higher priority programs meant that P-61 seconds would not reach combat squadrons until mid-1944, but the wait would prove worthwhile. The SCR-720 airborne interception radar that gave the Black Widow its deadly capability represented the cutting edge of 1940s electronics. Mounted in the aircraft's bulbous nose, its spinning antenna dish could detect enemy aircraft at ranges exceeding 5 miles in total darkness. The radar operator, seated in an isolated compartment behind the pilot, watched a circular cathode ray tube scope that painted targets as bright green blips against a darker background. He could simultaneously track range, bearing, and altitude, calling out corrections that guided the pilot to within visual range of an enemy that never knew it was being stalked. The Japanese had developed their own radar systems during the war, but these remained primitive compared to American microwave technology. Japanese airborne radar operated on longer wavelengths that provided lower resolution and shorter range. Japanese night fighters relied primarily on searchlights, ground control vectoring, and the Mark I eyeball for final interception, the same techniques that had proven inadequate over Europe in 1940. The concept of an aircraft that could see in total darkness, that could track and engage targets beyond the range of any searchlight, seemed fantastical to Japanese planners who had not witnessed Allied radar development firsthand. The Black Widow that would shatter Japanese assumptions arrived in the Philippines in late 1944. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had already proven its capabilities during earlier operations over New Guinea and Morotai, destroying Japanese raiders that had previously operated with impunity. Major Carroll C. Smith commanded the squadron, a pilot whose calm demeanor and exceptional skill would make him the highest-scoring American night fighter ace of the Pacific War, with 7 confirmed victories. Smith's aircraft, a P-61 Ampere's serial number 42-5595 and named times a Wastin, carried an arsenal that would have seemed excessive on any single-engine fighter aircraft. 4 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage, their muzzles protruding from the belly of the aircraft like the fangs of its namesake Spider. These weapons fired explosive shells at a rate of 600 rounds per minute each, capable of tearing an aircraft apart with a single well-placed burst. The P-61 could also carry 4 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in a remotely controlled dorsal turret, though on times a Wastin this turret was locked in the forward firing position to supplement the cannon armament. The combined firepower was devastating against any aircraft in the Japanese inventory. The Black Widow's twin Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines each generated 2,000 horsepower, giving the heavy fighter a top speed of 366 miles per hour, despite a maximum loaded weight exceeding 36,000 pounds. The aircraft's 66-foot wingspan provided exceptional stability, while its unique twin-boom configuration eliminated propeller wash interference with the tail surfaces. Pilots reported that the P-61 handled more like a medium aircraft than the heavy fighter its weight statistics suggested. The evening of December 29th began like countless others at McGuire Field, the American airstrip on Mindoro that had been operational for less than 2 weeks. American ground crews worked through the tropical twilight, servicing aircraft that had flown missions throughout the day. Fuel trucks moved between hard stands where fighters sat with engines still ticking as they cooled. Armorers loaded bombs and ammunition for the next day's strikes. The airfield hummed with the controlled chaos of a forward operating base supporting active combat operations against an enemy who remained dangerous despite 3 years of defeats. As darkness fell over Mindoro, the tempo changed dramatically. Day fighters were pushed into protective revetments or dispersed across the field to minimize the damage from expected Japanese night raids. Ground controllers activated their radar screens and began plotting the airspace over central Luzon and the surrounding waters. Anti-aircraft gunners checked their weapons and peered into the darkness, knowing that Japanese aircraft would almost certainly appear before dawn. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese aircrews were conducting their own pre-flight preparations, checking engines and armament for another night of operations against the American invaders who had returned to the Philippines. Major Smith and Lieutenant Porter had already completed their cockpit checks when the scramble order came through the radio. Ground control had detected multiple inbound contacts, apparently a coordinated operation rather than the usual single aircraft nuisance raid. The two men had flown together for months, first over New Guinea and then through the island-hopping campaign that had brought American forces back to the Philippines. They had developed the wordless coordination essential for successful night interception, each knowing his role without the need for extended discussion. Porter would find the targets using his radar. Smith would maneuver for position and kill them. The system had worked before in engagements over New Guinea and Morotai. Tonight it would work with devastating efficiency that neither man could have predicted. Times A. Wastin roared down the muddy runway at McGuire Field, its twin engines generating nearly 4,000 combined horsepower as Smith pulled the heavy fighter into the Philippine sky. The Black Widow climbed rapidly despite its combat weight of over 30,000 pounds, the supercharged R-2000, 800 seconds maintaining full power as the altimeter unwound steadily. Within minutes, Smith had reached patrol altitude and turned onto the heading provided by ground control. Behind him in the radar compartment, Porter was already bent over his scope, fine-tuning the SCR-720 for maximum detection range while filtering out ground clutter from the islands below. The first contact appeared at approximately 2100 hours local time. Porter's scope painted a single blip at the extreme edge of detection range, bearing northeast at roughly 12,000 feet altitude. The target was moving purposefully toward American positions, maintaining the steady course of an aircraft on a mission rather than the wandering track of a lost or damaged plane. Porter called out the intercept vector in the clipped professional tone that night fighter crews cultivated, and Smith banked the Black Widow onto a pursuit course that would bring them behind and below the target. The interception that followed demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of radar-guided night combat in its purest form. The Japanese aircraft, flying through darkness the crew believed provided complete concealment from American eyes, had no warning of the approaching danger. Their aircraft carried no radar warning receiver because no such equipment existed in the Japanese inventory. Their observers peered into blackness, seeing nothing but stars and the occasional flash of distant gunfire on the ground below. The first indication of trouble would be the flash of cannon fire, and by then it would be far too late. Smith closed steadily, following Porter's corrections as the range decreased from 5 miles to 4 to 3. The Black Widow's engines thrummed in the darkness, their exhaust flames suppressed by special shrouds designed to prevent the aircraft from betraying its presence. At 400 yards, Porter called visual contact, his voice betraying a hint of excitement despite months of combat experience. The silhouette of a Nakajima J1N Irving materialized against the slightly lighter sky, its twin engines trailing faint exhaust flames that provided just enough contrast to distinguish aircraft from darkness. The Irving was the same aircraft type Smith had studied in intelligence briefings, a capable platform with a distinguished if unconventional combat history. Japanese pilots had found it too large and sluggish for daylight combat against nimble Allied fighters, but darkness negated that weakness. Its crew of 2 or 3 included observers and gunners, armed with obliquely mounted 20mm cannons designed for attacking bombers from below. But those weapons were worse than useless against an enemy approaching from behind in total darkness. Smith aligned his illuminated gun sight with the practiced precision of a veteran night fighter pilot who had spent hundreds of hours training for exactly this moment. When he pressed the firing button on his control stick, 4 20mm Hispano cannons spoke simultaneously with a sound like tearing canvas magnified 1,000 times. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Explosive shells ripped through the Irving's unarmored fuselage, detonating fuel tanks and ammunition stores. The aircraft transformed into a falling meteor, flames consuming the airframe as it tumbled toward the jungle 3 miles below. No parachutes emerged from the inferno. The entire engagement, from first radar contact to confirmed destruction, had taken less than 15 minutes. Major Smith did not celebrate. There was no time for satisfaction when the night still held more targets. In the rear compartment, Lieutenant Porter was already tracking another contact on his scope, calling out range and bearing in the same professional tone he had used throughout the first engagement. The hunt continued. The second Japanese aircraft was flying approximately 20 miles behind the first, maintaining the loose formation Japanese crews used for night operations. This too was an Irving, its twin-engine silhouette distinctive against the tropical sky once Smith closed to visual range. The crew had undoubtedly seen the distant flash of their comrade's destruction, a ball of fire plunging earthward with no explanation. They had no way of knowing what had caused it. Engine failure was a constant threat with wartime aircraft maintained under field conditions. Anti-aircraft fire from hidden guns seemed possible, though American positions were supposed to be miles away. The possibility that an American fighter had found them in complete darkness, stalked them through the void, and destroyed their squadron mate with a single devastating burst seemed remote to the point of impossibility. Lieutenant Porter tracked the second target with the same methodical precision he had applied to the first, calling out range and bearing while Smith maneuvered the Black Widow into attack position. The Irving's pilot, perhaps alarmed by the fate of the lead aircraft, had begun slight evasive maneuvers. Gentle turns left and right, shallow climbs and descents designed to complicate anti-aircraft prediction against ground-based guns that had to calculate deflection across miles of sky. Such tactics were moderately effective. Against a radar-equipped night fighter following from a few hundred yards astern, they were completely useless. Smith closed from behind and below, approaching through the Irving's blind spot where neither pilot nor observers could possibly see an attacker without the assistance of radar they did not possess. Japanese gunners were notoriously alert, trained to scan constantly for approaching threats, but they could not shoot at what they could not see. At 300 yards, Smith opened fire. The burst was even briefer than the first engagement, perhaps 50 rounds from each cannon before he released the trigger. The Irving's wing root, where fuel tanks met the main structural spar, disintegrated under the impact of high explosive shells. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air, the wings folding upward as the fuselage tumbled away, trailing fire and debris. Burning wreckage scattered across miles of Philippine jungle, marking the grave of another Japanese aircrew who had trusted the darkness to protect them. 23 minutes had elapsed since times a Wastin lifted off from McGuire Field. 2 enemy aircraft destroyed. Smith's ammunition counters showed he had expended less than 200 rounds. More than enough remained for additional kills if targets presented themselves. The third contact proved different from the first two in ways that became apparent as the engagement developed. This aircraft was flying at lower altitude, perhaps 3,000 feet above the jungle canopy, apparently attempting to slip beneath American radar coverage. The tactic showed sophisticated understanding of radar limitations and might have worked against ground-based detection systems whose beams could not effectively illuminate targets below certain elevation angles. But Porter's airborne radar looked down as easily as it looked up, tracking targets against land and sea returns with only slightly reduced effectiveness. Smith descended through the darkness, bleeding altitude while maintaining pursuit. The Black Widow handled the transition smoothly, its spoiler ailerons providing precise roll control even as airspeed built during the dive. Porter maintained constant contact, calling corrections as the range steadily decreased. As they closed within visual distance, the target's silhouette resolved into something unexpected. This was not another twin-engine aircraft. The distinctive shape of a floatplane fighter emerged from the gloom, the large central float and smaller wing-mounted stabilizers clearly visible against the slightly lighter water below. An A6M2-N Rufe was operating alone over the waters near Mindoro. The Rufe was the floatplane variant of the legendary Zero fighter, modified with pontoons that allowed it to operate from protected anchorages, rivers, and coastal waters without the need for conventional runways. Japanese forces had used Rufe floatplanes extensively throughout the island campaigns, where their ability to deploy from almost any body of calm water provided tactical flexibility that land-based aircraft could not match. The modification added considerable weight and drag, reducing performance compared to the standard Zero, but the aircraft remained dangerous in the hands of a skilled pilot. The Rufe pilot remained oblivious to the predator stalking him through the darkness. His aircraft droned onward, perhaps returning from a reconnaissance mission or searching for American shipping in the waters around Mindoro. Whatever his mission, he would never complete it. Smith achieved an ideal firing position, directly astern, and slightly below where the Rufe's single-engine exhaust flame provided just enough contrast to center the gun sight. His cannon burst struck the floatplane's center fuselage where the fuel tank was located behind the pilot's seat. The aircraft erupted in flames instantly, the additional fuel carried in the large central float contributing to a spectacular fireball visible for miles in every direction. The Rufe tumbled toward the dark water below, burning fiercely until it struck the surface and vanished. 47 minutes into the mission. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed. Smith's ammunition expenditure remained remarkably low, testimony to the precision that radar-guided night interception made possible. The fourth and final target of the night was detected almost by accident, a stroke of fortune that transformed an already exceptional mission into something approaching legend. Porter had swept his radar through a routine scan, while Smith repositioned for the return to McGuire Field, checking for any threats that might be approaching the American airfield during their absence. A faint blip appeared at the edge of detection range, moving perpendicular to their course rather than toward American positions. This aircraft was not heading for McGuire Field. It appeared to be patrolling, perhaps searching for American aircraft to intercept or maintaining a barrier patrol against incoming raids. Smith made the decision instantly, the calculation automatic after months of night combat experience. Fuel reserves remained adequate for an extended engagement and the return flight. Ammunition supply was reduced but still sufficient for multiple kills if the opportunities arose. The night was still young by combat aviation standards. He banked the Black Widow onto an intercept course and began the pursuit, pushing the throttles forward to close the range before the target could disappear beyond radar coverage. This final engagement proved the longest of the night, a stern chase that stretched across 40 miles of Philippine airspace as Smith slowly closed on a target that proved faster than any he had previously engaged. The Japanese aircraft was maintaining a patrol pattern that required Smith to cut across the geometry rather than simply follow from behind. Porter maintained constant radar contact while reporting the closing range, his voice calm despite the extended nature of the pursuit. Smith pushed his engines to maximum continuous power, the supercharged R2800 seconds responding with the deep throb that indicated full military rating. What emerged from the darkness when Smith finally achieved visual range was one of Japan's finest fighters. The Nakajima Ki-84 the Frank, was the aircraft Smith had described earlier in briefings as perhaps the most dangerous opponent a P-61 crew could face in daylight. But this was not daylight. Darkness had stripped away every advantage the Frank possessed. Its excellent cockpit visibility meant nothing when there was nothing to see. Its nimble handling characteristics could not help a pilot evade an attacker he did not know was there. Its powerful armament sat unused because there was no target visible to engage. The fourth aircraft died as the others had died, with no warning and no possibility of defense. Smith's cannon fire found the fuel tanks despite the Frank's self-sealing construction. The aircraft's armor protected the pilot from small arms fire but offered no defense against 20mm explosive shells. Flames erupted from the stricken fighter as it rolled into an uncontrolled dive toward the jungle below. The engagement used only a handful of rounds from Smith's diminishing ammunition supply. Another experienced Japanese aviator had simply vanished during night operations over the Philippines. 80 minutes after takeoff, Major Carroll C. Smith turned Times a Wastin toward McGuire Field and home. Behind him, the wreckage of 4 Japanese aircraft burned in the Philippine jungle and waters. 2 Irvings, 1 Rufe, and 1 Frank had fallen to his guns, destroyed in a single mission of breathtaking efficiency. In total, Smith had expended only 382 rounds of 20mm ammunition to destroy 4 enemy aircraft. The precision was staggering, testimony to the advantage that radar guidance provided in night combat. The destruction of 4 aircraft in a single mission represented an extraordinary achievement that few night fighter pilots anywhere in the world had ever matched before or since. The aerial victory was not merely impressive in numbers but in the variety of aircraft types destroyed. 2 twin-engine Nakajima J1N Irvings, 1 A6M2-N Rufe floatplane fighter, and 1 Nakajima Ki-84. Frank represented a cross-section of Japanese night aviation capability, all eliminated in a single patrol. The achievement would be recognized with the award of the Silver Star for gallantry in action, one of the highest decorations available for combat valor. But Smith's remarkable run continued beyond that extraordinary December night. His seventh and final confirmed victory came the following night, December 30th, when he engaged and destroyed another Ki-84 Frank over the Philippines. This kill came against a pilot identified in Japanese records as Sergeant Akira Kusano, an experienced aviator who became another victim of radar technology he never saw coming. The achievement made Smith not just an ace, but the highest-scoring American night fighter pilot in the Pacific theater. No other pilot flying Black Widows in the Pacific would match his total of 7 confirmed aerial victories. Lieutenant Philip Porter shared credit for these kills as the radar operator whose skill made the interceptions possible. The partnership between pilot and radar operator was essential to night fighter success, and Smith and Porter had developed that partnership to a level of excellence that few crews anywhere achieved. The impact on Japanese operations was immediate and dramatic. During the final weeks of December 1944, Black Widows of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron destroyed multiple Japanese aircraft in rapid succession. The squadron would ultimately be credited with 18 aerial victories during the war, the highest total of any Pacific Theater night fighter squadron. Night raids against American positions dropped sharply in frequency as Japanese commanders recognized that darkness no longer provided the protection it once had. Aircrews who had conducted harassment raids with near impunity suddenly faced an invisible enemy that struck without warning. The psychological warfare value of the washing machine Charlie raids evaporated when the raiders themselves began disappearing without explanation. Intelligence reports from captured Japanese personnel revealed the psychological devastation that Black Widow operations inflicted on enemy morale. Aircrews who had operated with relative confidence for years suddenly learned that the Americans possessed aircraft capable of seeing in total darkness. The technology seemed almost supernatural to pilots who had trusted the night to conceal their movements. One captured aviator described the experience of comrades who had encountered Black Widows and somehow survived. They reported seeing nothing before the attack came. There was only the sudden explosion of cannon fire, then flames consuming their aircraft. The ability to fight back was non-existent because there was nothing visible to fight. Japanese forces attempted various countermeasures against the American night fighters, none of which proved effective. Dropping metallic chaff to confuse radar had some effect against ground-based systems, but did little to fool airborne radar operated by skilled technicians like Porter, who could distinguish real targets from interference patterns. Flying at extremely low altitude could potentially avoid detection but brought aircraft within range of anti-aircraft guns and risked collision with terrain invisible in the darkness. Flying at very high altitude was theoretically possible but sacrificed bomb load for altitude that provided no real protection against an enemy who could climb to meet any threat. Some Japanese units experimented with timing their missions to coincide with periods of heavy cloud cover or rain, hoping the weather would degrade American radar effectiveness, but these tactics proved equally futile. The technical superiority demonstrated by the P-61 extended far beyond its radar system, though that system represented perhaps the most dramatic evidence of American technological capability. Japanese analysts who examined captured American equipment and interrogated prisoners discovered engineering sophistication across virtually every component and system that exceeded their most pessimistic assessments of what American industry could produce under wartime conditions. The gap was not merely quantitative but qualitative, representing fundamental differences in manufacturing, capability, and engineering knowledge. The aircraft's twin Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines each generated 2,000 horsepower, more than double the output of engines powering most Japanese fighters. These power plants represented the pinnacle of American radial engine development, incorporating 2 rows of 9 cylinders each for a total displacement of over 2,800 cubic inches. Sophisticated 2-stage supercharging systems maintained full power at high altitudes where naturally aspirated engines would have lost effectiveness. Manufacturing tolerances for critical components like cylinder barrels, pistons, and crankshafts exceeded anything Japanese industry could reliably produce in quantity. American factories turned out R-2800 engines by the thousands, while Japanese engine production struggled to meet demands with inferior designs. The Black Widow's size, which Japanese intelligence had initially assumed to be a weakness that would make it slow and unmaneuverable, proved instead to be an advantage in multiple ways. Its 66-foot wingspan provided exceptional stability in turbulent air, allowing Porter to maintain steady radar tracking even in conditions that would have defeated smaller aircraft. The twin-boom design eliminated propeller wash interference with the tail surfaces, giving pilots precise control during the delicate final moments of an interception. The aircraft could sustain punishing maneuvers that would have overstressed lighter fighters. Test pilots had demonstrated that despite its size and weight, the P-61 could outturn most single-engine fighters in low-speed combat. The SCR-720 radar system itself represented a generation of technological advancement that Japan could not match despite efforts throughout the war. The set operated on microwave frequencies that required vacuum tubes and magnetron transmitters manufactured to tolerances Japanese industry had never achieved. The rotating antenna dish in the Black Widow's nose was precision machined from aluminum alloy to specifications that would have challenged any factory in the Japanese Empire. American technicians calibrated these radar sets with test equipment that existed nowhere outside Allied nations. Japanese radar development remained stuck on longer wavelengths that provided inferior resolution and shorter detection range. Most devastating to Japanese strategic assessments was the realization that the Black Widow was being produced in significant quantities. This remarkable aircraft was not a prototype or a limited production special weapon. Northrop factories in Hawthorne, California, ultimately produced 706 P-61 aircraft across all variants. Every month brought more Black Widows to frontline squadrons. American industrial capacity seemed limitless to Japanese planners who watched their own production numbers decline steadily as bombing campaigns destroyed factories and supply chains. The statistical record of P-61 operations demonstrates the aircraft's extraordinary effectiveness when judged against the challenging conditions of night combat. By war's end, Black Widow squadrons had destroyed 127 enemy aircraft across all theaters, plus 18 German 5-1 flying bombs over Europe. In the Pacific alone, P-61 seconds accounted for 64 confirmed aerial victories against Japanese aircraft of all types, from nimble fighters to lumbering bombers. These numbers might seem modest compared to the thousands of victories accumulated by American day fighter squadrons flying P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts in the crowded skies of Europe and the Pacific. But they must be understood in context. Night fighter operations involved far fewer sorties than daytime missions because targets were scarce and difficult to find, even with radar assistance. Japanese night operations became increasingly rare as losses mounted and surviving air crews recognized the danger they faced. The conditions were far more demanding than daylight combat, with pilots and radar operators operating in darkness for hours while maintaining the concentration necessary for successful interception. The loss ratio tells the most compelling story of Black Widow effectiveness. 127 enemy aircraft destroyed against extraordinarily low losses speaks to the aircraft's survivability and the skill of the crews who flew it. In the Pacific theater, only 4 P-61 seconds were lost to all causes, and none of these losses resulted from direct enemy action. The aircraft were lost to mechanical failure, navigation error, and weather. Not one Black Widow fell to Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft fire throughout the Pacific campaign. This invulnerability was not accidental but reflected both the aircraft's excellent design and the operational advantages that radar provided to crews who used it skillfully. The Japanese air crews who died on December 29, 1944, joined tens of thousands of their countrymen who fell to American air power during the final terrible year of the Pacific War. The 4 aircraft destroyed that night carried crews ranging from the single pilot of the Rufe floatplane to teams of 2 or 3 men aboard the twin-engine Irvings and the Ki-84 Frank. None survived to report what had happened. None had the opportunity to warn their comrades about the invisible hunter that stalked Philippine skies. The families of these men waited in Japan for word that would never come in the form they hoped. Missing in action reports offered no explanation for the disappearance of aircraft that had departed for routine night missions and simply vanished into darkness. Some families clung to hope that their sons and husbands might have survived, perhaps captured by American forces or stranded on remote islands awaiting rescue. This hope was false. The Black Widow left no survivors from the aircraft it destroyed. The violence of 20mm cannon fire against unarmored or lightly armored aircraft was absolute and final. Entire crews perished in seconds, their last moments spent in confusion as fire erupted from nowhere in the night sky. American forces experienced losses as well during the Night Fighter campaign over the Pacific, though on a far smaller scale than their opponents suffered. Ground crews working on Black Widows faced constant danger from accidents involving volatile aviation fuels and heavy ordnance. Pilots and radar operators pushed their aircraft and themselves to exhaustion during extended patrols that lasted 6 hours or more. The tropical climate-bred disease that hospitalized more men than enemy action wounded. But the disparity in combat casualties reflected the disparity in technological capability. The Black Widow had transformed night combat from a contest into an execution. The final aerial victories of World War II belonged to a Black Widow, fitting testimony to the aircraft's dominance of night combat in the Pacific theater. On the nights of August 14th and 15th, 1945, a P-61B named Lady in the Dark from the 548th Night Fighter Squadron encountered Japanese aircraft in the hours surrounding Emperor Hirohito's radio announcement that Japan would accept Allied surrender terms. In both cases, the enemy pilots crashed without Lady in the Dark firing a single round of ammunition. On August 14th, Lieutenant Robert Clyde and radar operator Lieutenant Bruce LaFord were vectored onto a Japanese fighter approaching at low altitude. The enemy pilot spotted the pursuing Black Widow and descended to wave top level, beginning a series of desperate evasive maneuvers that ended when his aircraft struck the water and exploded. The following night, Captain Lee Kendall and radar operator Lieutenant John Shearer encountered a Nakajima Ki-84 Tojo attempting to approach American positions. Kendall pursued aggressively through the darkness until the Japanese pilot, unable to see his attacker and unable to shake him, lost control during violent evasive maneuvers. The Tojo crashed without a shot being fired. These final kills represented perhaps the ultimate demonstration that American technology had achieved complete mastery of the night sky. The P-61 Black Widow remained in American service until the late 1940s, serving roles far beyond its original night fighter mission as the post-war military adapted to new challenges. The aircraft that had proven so deadly against Japanese night raiders found new employment in peacetime roles that capitalized on its range, radar capability, and rugged construction. Some Black Widows were converted to reconnaissance aircraft designated F-15 Reporter, their radar compartments modified to carry specialized cameras for photo mapping missions across the Pacific Islands where so many Americans had fought and died. These reconnaissance variants helped survey and map territories that would become increasingly important as the Cold War developed. Others served in weather research programs that pushed the boundaries of meteorological science. The National Thunderstorm Project of 1946 and 47 used modified P-61 seconds to penetrate severe weather systems, gathering data that would revolutionize understanding of storm formation and behavior. The aircraft's radar proved invaluable for locating and tracking storm cells, while its structural strength allowed penetration of turbulence that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Data gathered by these missions contributed to improved weather forecasting and safer air travel for civilian passengers in the decades that followed. The last P-61 was retired from government service in 1954, its mission taken over by jet aircraft that incorporated the lessons learned from Black Widow operations. Today, only 4 Black Widows survive in museums around the world, testament to both the aircraft's wartime attrition and post-war scrapping. One is displayed at the National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center near Washington, a P-61C that participated in cold weather testing and the National Thunderstorm Project. Another was recovered from a mountain in New Guinea, where it had crashed during the war, and now resides at the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum in Pennsylvania after years of painstaking restoration. A third is displayed at the Beijing Aviation Museum in China, captured from nationalist forces after the Chinese Civil War. The fourth underwent restoration in Ohio. These survivors stand as monuments to a brief moment when American technology achieved complete dominance over an enemy who had believed the night was his sanctuary. The night of December 29, 1944 marked a significant turning point that few recognized at the time, but that changed the nature of aerial warfare permanently. Major Carroll C. Tense, Smith and Lieutenant Philip Porter demonstrated that American technology had achieved a level of sophistication that enemy forces could not match and could not counter. 4 aircraft destroyed in 80 minutes was not merely an impressive tactical achievement. It was a statement about the nature of industrial warfare and the consequences of technological inferiority. The Japanese military had entered the war believing that warrior spirit and fighting prowess could overcome material disadvantage. They had gambled that initial victories would secure a negotiated peace before American industrial might could be mobilized. Both assumptions proved fatal. The spirit that sent aircrews into Philippine skies night after night could not protect them from radar that saw through darkness. The peace Japan sought never came, and American industry produced weapons of increasing sophistication in ever greater quantities until the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war. In the most devastating demonstration of technological superiority the world had ever witnessed. The P-61 Black Widow represented American technological advantage in its most concentrated form. It was not the largest aircraft of the war, nor the fastest, nor the most heavily armed, but it was uniquely capable of finding and destroying enemies who believed themselves invisible in the darkness. In this capability lay a lesson about modern warfare that would shape military thinking for decades to come. The nation that could see in the dark would rule the night. The nation that could not would perish in flames, as 4 Japanese aircrews discovered over the Philippines on a December night in 1944. 80 minutes changed everything completely and forever. The Japanese military high command would never again believe that the cover of darkness could protect them from American firepower and technological superiority.